Welcome to CalTAP Veteran Cultural Competency Training, brought to you by Swords to Plowshares Institute for Veteran Policy. At the end of this general training, we encourage you to view one of the in-depth trainings tailored for specific professionals. Whether you provide housing, education, employment, legal, healthcare, or other services, or simply want to connect with your veteran friends and neighbors, these materials will inform and improve your interactions.
Why is general cultural competency important? Veterans experience significant, life-changing events that affect them for the rest of their lives, and a culturally informed approach will benefit the veteran and significantly improve the quality of services you provide. When we talk about suggested material for review, we are strongly encouraging to review all of the materials presented within this module before continuing on to additional provider group modules. What will you learn in today's presentation? We're going to be talking about common identifiers and behaviors within the veterans as a culture group, the life cycle of military enlistment, transition challenges and issues, and we're also going to be going into resources and strategies. We will be providing videos as well as clips from combat to community presentations from Swords to Plowshares that we have given in the past. With that being said, Shannon, a Navy veteran, is going to be starting this conversation for us.
Let's start with this. By a show of hands, who here has been in the military? What branch? Army. Your Army? I'm so sorry. I'm kidding. I was right. By a show of hands, who here has close friends or family that's been in the military? Okay. So out of that group, who here has had an honest and frank conversation about that veteran's military experience? Are you sure? You positive? There's no right or wrong answer with that. I ask that question because realistically there aren't that many veterans in the United States. This population encompasses about, I've heard everywhere from 12% to 1% of the U.S. American population has been in the military in some form or fashion. Now, what that does is that this is a really heavy experience, okay? And it's hard to kind of talk about that, you know? And so when we don't have that conversation, like an honest and frank conversation, not a vulgar conversation, not an explicit or really mean conversation, but an honest and open conversation about this, everyone gets their information from the media. So Hollywood with movies, fictionalized TV shows, news medias, books, magazines, and especially in this day and age, primarily with younger generation, video games. You know, and so there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of falsehoods and a lot of mythology around this population.
An important element of what we're going to be talking about is how ultimately these are significant life-changing events that impact the individual for the rest of their lives. These impacts inform a perspective, which in turn creates a filter. This filter dictates how veterans view the world around them. This perspective and filter both carry positive and negative outcomes for veterans and our environment. These are the 5 branches of the armed forces. All branches have an active duty and reserve component. Only the Air Force and the Army have National Guard components. What makes service members in the Guard different from other components? Guard members tend to be older and have more responsibilities outside of military service. They also tend to have less military support than active duty service members. It's also important to note that they're ineligible for VA benefits unless it's written to their contract or they've been federalized. Federalized is being called into active duty status for any national emergency or being called into combat operations. This is the enlisted corps. They are the largest component of military service. They typically generally tend to be younger and less educated than compared to the officer corps. So this is what we typically think of when we think of people who are doing a lot of the main work within the military, doing a lot of the specific stuff, handling the day-to-day operations. This is the officer corps. They tend to be generally older. They tend to be starting out in their mid-20s. And the reason for this is to become a commissioned officer, you typically have to have a college degree of some sort, or at least some college background. These are the elements of military culture. For the most part, these elements are very similar to every organization, agency, business that you can think of. What is important here, what's important to highlight here, is the routine and structure and the aggression. Routine and structure because fundamentally you're not going to see a level of regimentation within the military that you're going to see in the civilian world. And you know what your life is like for days out at a time, and you've got this hardened structural lifestyle, and it becomes ingrained in you. And oftentimes veterans, when they're coming into the civilian world, lose that structure and it catches them off guard. The day-to-day kind of having to deal without that routine and structure can be a little bit wary and weird, and some people end up missing that or have to find ways to reaccommodate to being outside of that. Aggression is an important one, and one that's going to be reoccurring through the point of this presentation, because aggression for us is a very natural part of being in the military. It's a natural part of being in the service. We're supposed to be faster, we're supposed to be harder, we're supposed to be louder, and we're supposed to be meaner. Except what happens here is we end up creating it as a baseline, and we end up not conceptualizing it as aggression at a certain point. And so what we think of how we interact with each other and we think of what we do in the military is not necessarily aggressive, but more being assertive or being forward. And then we come back into the civilian world, and all of a sudden other people are viewing us as more aggressive or more assertive, when that isn't how we're necessarily perceiving ourselves.
Out of the 240 years of this country being in existence, do you know how many years we've been deployed in active combat operations? Take a wild guess. 222 years. Out of those 240 years, we've been in either deployed overseas or in active combat operations. Think about that. Since the inception of this country, we've spent more time overseas running and gunning than we have in peace.
We have to understand that the United States military has been deployed to every continent on the planet. When we think of Operation Enduring Freedom as one of our more recent conflicts, even that has been taking in two completely different countries. We're talking about Afghanistan and the Philippines, even though oftentimes we only conceptualize it as having been in Afghanistan. And all of these shape the experience of a service member, of what it looks like that they've gone through, of the things that they've witnessed on ground. And it's important to keep in mind when we talk about veterans, kind of the full width of the operations that the U.S. military is doing. We're going to go through this slide by slide, but this is an all-encompassing existence. We're talking about this all happening over the course of years, controlling every aspect of a service member's life. The first enlistment is always 8 years, and that's broken up by the needs of the military branches. So that can look something like 6 years active, 2 years inactive, 4 years active, 4 years inactive. And it really varies. Like, nobody's just casually joining for a year, going into the military, and then leaving. That's not how the contracts necessarily work. So here's how it begins. We're going to watch a short video of basic training.
Competency! You give the proper training on the day! First general order! Michigan's first general order is to take charge of the policy on government property! Johnny weapon! Johnny weapon! Proper training! Proper training! Bullet! 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 I'm waiting for fire! First general order! Second general order! Second general order! Now! You give a green! You give a green! Report! 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 Weapons zero number! Weapons zero number! 105-203! 105-203, sir! Grab it out!
So the first day of basic training in a lot of ways is kind of like the first day of high school or college. I know it sounds kind of funny to say. Obviously, this can be quite a bit more traumatizing and a lot of instant regrets. But when we really break it down, you know, you're still encountering those same social anxieties. It's a new environment. it can oftentimes come off as a hostile environment. And what's unique more in the capacity of first days of joining the military is if you go in and you realize, hey, like this is not a thing I'm cool with or I'm not really comfortable with it, it's a bit too late. Obviously, with high school, you can't necessarily just decide that you're going to pull back, go to another high school or anything like that. You could with college, but that might be a bad call. But within the military, once you were at that point, you are committed. This is important in the sense that this is where we're talking about a deconstruction of civilian identity and a creation of the service member identity. We're talking about a total reconstruction, a reconditioning. There's a utilization of behaviorism, positive and negative reinforcement, and physical training. Physical punishment is very much a real thing here. All types of punishments are very much a real thing here. A lot of people, if they were to look at what happens in basic training and if they were to try and draw it over into civilian life, might see it as really traumatizing and abusive. And even when we look at basic training now, that those elements, like, that doesn't change. It's still very traumatizing. It's still very abusive because it's trying to change a person who's coming in, anywhere from 17 to early 20s and fundamentally rebuild them in a way to where they can operate as part of this bigger machine and in a way that they can conform to service within the military. And this reinforces all that. Like when we're talking about learning the basics of military cultures, customs, and policies, we're talking about an attitude shift, an ethics shift, or a personal value shift, and providing the absolute basic tools necessary to perform the role of a military member. After basic training, you go into advanced training, or advanced individual training, AIT. It's a further indoctrination into military culture. You're learning the skills of your individual military occupational specialty or your job within the military. And it's a reinforcement of military identity and ideology. I remember when I was going through school, we were observing other people getting into AIT and how much easier it seemed to be for them than basic training. And, we're excited. We're getting to the end of basic training. It's been rough, and we're excited to what we think is going to make our lives a bit easier. In the moment we get into AIT, we were military police, and our drill sergeants were like, no, we hold you to a high standard. It's not going to get any easier. It's only going to get harder from here. And their intent was, we're going to weed you out. We're going to find out if you're fit to be military police or not. And that was some of the more difficult time periods of my life, and even in comparison to other parts of my military career, I would much rather do other elements of my military career than ever go back to basic training or ever go back to advanced individual training. So the next step in your life cycle of military enlistment is your assignment to unit. Your first duty station selection is made either in basic or technical training, and it can be based upon your preferences. Like, you can go ahead and submit them, but ultimately it's about the needs of the services. And this can be located anywhere in the continental United States or located overseas. If you're National Guard, you're just going to be posted to your local resident duty station. And it's a constant reinforcement of military culture and ideology through supervisors, peers, and supervisees. In high school, there's oftentimes we can think of, peer pressure to do something. And, sometimes we can joke about it all we want. But in the military, you definitely see a lot of reinforcement of military norms as done through peers and as done through peer pressure. This is really done in order to have you adapt to the unit norms, and really, quote unquote, kind of fit in and be a functioning member of that unit. This is also typical of part of the life cycle of military enlistment. It may not necessarily be the case for Reserve or National Guard units as much. At least prior to 9/11, there were National Guard units where deployments may have not been necessarily a thing, or they were very much non-combat related deployments. But deployments can be combat or non-combat related. They can encompass all the activities from origin or home station through destination, specifically including intercontinental United States, intertheater and intratheater movement, leg staging, and holding areas. So a deployment could last longer than a year. It can be shorter than a year as well, but there are quite a few cases where you're seeing them go for 12 to 15 months. And they're usually deployed as part of multiple peacekeeping missions, military attachments or a part of being embassy and consulate security. And again, I said that this just a few seconds ago, but deployment lengths can vary for time, and they can last anywhere from 90 days to 15 months. This is your end of active obligated service. Typically, this is you exiting the military. When we think about all the process it takes for you to become a service member, and then compare it to the process of you leaving, you can exit the military within 24 hours. You may get some transition support, specifically through TAPS, which has been more recently better developed. But a few years back, there wasn't necessarily that transition assistance as well. And so they're not reconditioning you and they're not retraining you to go back into civilian society. And that's where separation and transition, we start seeing a lot of different issues. There's protective factors through transition that can help out post-military life. So if we're talking about community and social support, positive coping strategies, a whole host of things in order to be able to help you better adapt when you're coming out of the military. But those are also a lot of people don't necessarily have these things, or they may not necessarily think that they're necessary, or there's not any forward planning into coming into the civilian world. And in turn, there could be a lot of challenges for transitioning veterans. So who is a veteran? Not everyone who is in the military self-identifies as a veteran, and that's important. We can often see when it comes to research or different statistics, if you're asking for a person to self-disclose, if you ask them, are you a veteran, you're less likely to get a response than if you were to ask if they had served in the military. Now, why is that? That's for a whole host of reasons. They could either not be comfortable being titled as a veteran, maybe they didn't deploy to a combat zone, therefore they don't view themselves as a veteran or necessarily identify as a veteran. I know personally when we were coming back from Afghanistan, we're young, early 20s, and to now somehow conceptualize ourselves as veterans when oftentimes we're thinking of these older people that have been out of the military for some time, it was weird. We didn't relate to the term. We didn't feel comfortable to the term. And it was something that we didn't refer to ourselves as. And that's important because when we think about veterans, even, as service members ourselves, we stereotype veterans at times. And common stereotypes that we can think about is all veterans are in crisis, all veterans served in combat, and all veterans have access to the Department of Veterans Affairs, which that's not true for quite a few veterans on all three of these boards. There are veterans who are absolutely fine. There are veterans who've been in combat who are absolutely fine. There's a lot of service members that have never experienced combat and they're veterans. And when we talk about accessibility to Department of VA, that's a whole other thing that we can really get in depth on. We will later down the line. Well, again, talking about identifying a veteran, we talk about veteran stereotypes. Who is a veteran? When we think about the look, we can kind of have that stereotypical look, even though it's by no means exclusive to veterans or service members. But the reality is that anybody can be a veteran. Anybody can look like a veteran. When we think of all these people, every single one of them's a veteran. Is there some cohesive look to them? Is there something that kind of draws them together that somehow identifies them all as a veteran? Not necessarily. When we think of B. Arthur, she was a former Marine. Jimi Hendrix, he was a former U.S. Army paratrooper. When we talk about pre-9/11 veterans, we're talking about groups such as Vietnam era veterans that served in the 60s and early 70s. We're also talking about the first Gulf War era veterans who served in the early 90s. Most of these veterans that we deal with today are now Gulf War era veterans. This is a recent change. This is the current number for post 9/11 veterans. As we can see, it's about 2.8 million men and women have been deployed September 2001. About 48% have had multiple deployments and 61% have obtained VA health care. This population is projected to increase over time. California is home to more veterans than any other state in the Union. The largest populations tend to be in our largest urban areas. They're in Southern California, LA, San Diego, and the Bay Area. But there are veterans in every part of the state, urban and rural, and it is incumbent on us to make sure that all of them have quality, culturally competent services. We're going to be talking about military operations other than war, and we will be starting that off with a video.
The search continues today for a missing Marine Corps helicopter and its crew. Disappeared while delivering aid in Nepal. That chopper was carrying 6 Marines and 2 Nepalese soldiers. So far, it has had no communication with officials and no signal from the emergency beacon has been detected.
Unfortunately, that helicopter was found, and everybody that was in the helicopter had passed. Again, this was not a combat environment. They weren't necessarily worried about getting shot out of the air or anything like that. They were helping in a natural disaster and still unfortunately lost their lives. And I can imagine that their crewmates, the people that served with them, this was a huge loss for them, and it was a traumatic event for them. Military operations other than war are the bulk of military operations. Most of these operations are humanitarian, disaster recovery, and concern themselves a lot more with logistics and kind of serving as a direct aid group instead. So what's interesting to note here is when we think of life-changing events and we think, the majority of the military has not experienced combat. They have not been in a conflict situation. And there's a ton of veterans that may have never served in a theater of war or a theater or conflict zone, but they've served in military operations other than war, which can still pose dangers to themselves, can still pose traumatic events to themselves, and can still create significant life-changing events. How current conflicts differ from prior conflicts is we're talking about more deployments. When we think about Vietnam and we think about deployments of service members to Vietnam, there was a significant number of people that may have only actually faced one deployment during the Vietnam War. Whereas we're looking at a significantly higher number within modern conflicts where we're seeing more deployments. Not just that, we're seeing that these deployments are also longer. It's also a situation similar to Vietnam where it's more 360 degrees of fighting. There aren't really front lines, and it's more of asymmetrical combat. And now it's more true ever than today, is we're not having a clear enemy. And this creates unique situations because rather than your concern being about a particular individual dressed in a certain uniform and engaging that individual, you're now concerned about a person who looks like an average civilian that maybe is on their cell phone, and that cell phone could potentially detonate an improvised explosive device. Talking about conflict, we will be starting a combat video in the following slide. If there are any triggers that you might have that is particular to that, feel free to go ahead and skip it. It is noteworthy that there's nothing necessarily graphic. It's just a very intense, violent situation. But it is important to kind of get an idea of what a veteran might be going through in a combat zone.
Stand by for another frag. Frag out. Get back, get back. I don't know what the fuck he's doing. I can't see. I don't like this. Yeah, I'm not gonna flashlight. He's gone. How you know? He was laying. Because he was fucking laying right there. He's not there no more. He was laying up on. I shot him like 5 times when I came back in the second time. He was laying right there. Hold on, let me see. Hey, y'all ain't seen nothing coming out here? The motherfucker ain't there no more. All right. Hey, let's watch each other's back, baby. Watch each other's back. Got a weapon? Okay. Got another grenade. Now you got one? Go! 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 Damn! Jesus Christ! Fuck! Jesus! Hey! Hey! The motherfucker's got a fortified bunker in there. If you want to go, I'll go first. But I mean, I don't fucking want to. Wait. Where you at this time? Where you go, bitch? Hey, we got him!
How you know? You hear him? Fuck that. No. Watch your face, man. Room. We got way too many rooms on our right and left. You hear something? No. Back me up, Matt. Back me up. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Maulana wa la Maula lahu! Allahu Akbar! Hey, come out! Come out! Yalla! What do you want to do? I want to get off this fucking roof. I don't want to run across that fucking window anymore. Huh? I don't want to run across that window anymore. That's a long distance. That's short distance right for us. RPG ready to go. Andy, you know see what I was doing? I'm looking underneath. Let's get down there. RPG ready to go. Meadows, is there a room right there? To the right, there's not one. That door's moving. Somebody's been shot in here. Which door's moving? Finish shooting. Watch to your right. I got this one. I mean your left. I got this one for you. Matt, watch your right. Me and Meadows going left. I'm gonna shoot it again when I get down there.
That was a pretty intense video, wasn't it? It's interesting, when we do this training, we do it often for CIT, crisis intervention team trainings throughout California. And inevitably there's always a few former or current SWAT officers or tactical response unit officers in the classroom. And I always ask them, I always say, okay, well what's your feeling from that? What do you get out of this video that we just watched? And they always say, like, it looks like a hot mess. It really looks like a hot mess. There's very little direction aside from survival. And that's very true. And then I always say, okay, well how often do you do these room or building clearings? And they always say, well, I always say, okay, I would go like this. How many a day do you do? Well, I don't really do any during the day. Okay, what about in a week? About a month. Well, maybe about like 2, sometimes a month. Okay, well, what about in a year? Handful, more often than not, and that's even here in San Francisco. All right, so we'll think about this. These individuals could be on their third house on the 4th day of the 3rd week of a 12-week operation, right? And they're just turning and burning, where you're getting maybe 2 hours of sleep, maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. You're only really getting resupplied with ammunition, batteries for your electronic gear that you're carrying, water, grenades, maybe an MRE every once in a while, but that's it. And you're on this op tempo or operations tempo where you're just going. And the stress that creates in your life is intense. I want you to remember what we talked about at the beginning of this training, the whole idea of significant life-changing events that impact the individual for the rest of their life, right? And this is one of those impacts, but none of this happens in isolation. Those impacts include the basic training, the advanced training, those non-combat deployments, but this combat deployment as well. And so this is also one aspect of combat, and this is the most pervasive aspect of combat that we see. We see this in news, we see this on TV shows, we see this in movies. We read about it in books about combat, we read it in magazines, we play it in video games. And it's true, this happens, but I want to show you another video that I think is more pervasive for the service member's existence while they're deployed to a combat zone. Now again, another trigger warning that if you're stressed out, get up and leave, and then we'll pick this back up because I want you to be present and aware for the rest of the presentation. So let's watch this video.
No, not yet. I am. You want your hip? You alright? Arm. You alright?
Hey, Josh, get in the 103.
Hey, get on. I'm blowing this. Hey. Go, I'm blowing this. Bardo! Ready? Go. Good. It's not doing anything. I think you cut the fucking...
More coming!
Keep coming! Come on. Keep coming! Ramp up! My bag's still out there, so we gotta get out and get it. Right. Hey, cut the line in half. Hey, let's go! Ramp up! Get the ramp up!
Seeing those videos of intensity of training, service, and deployment, it comes as no surprise that troops are exposed to physical and mental health injuries. When we talk about military-related stress and injuries, these are some of the illnesses and injuries that veterans might have. To be absolutely clear, most veterans are just fine. But for those who have service-related injuries, it's important for us to understand them and provide services. If you're an employer, understand that the entire population can have mental health issues, and most do not present barriers to employment. If you are a primary healthcare provider, understand that veterans may have trauma which can provide implications for other health conditions. A lot of people assume that benefits are kind of a given or kind of a default, and that's not true. Benefits are not automatic. You have to go and actively apply, and you also have to meet certain criteria to get them. They always get assistance when applying for benefits, like in that process. Make sure you have evidence and proof. It's vital to have a DD-214, your service and medical records. If you want to get benefits, these are hands down substantial in order to get that. Without a DD-214, a lot of us kind of jokingly say you can't prove that you ever existed in the military without a DD-214. Healthcare for combat veterans is free for 5 years after deployment, but the veteran must go to the VA Medical Center to apply in person. And then mental health care for veterans is free for 1 year past separation. Continuing on benefits, again, we say it's not a given. It's important to recognize that benefits are also dependent upon your military discharge type. So, honorable discharge, you're eligible for your VA benefits. General, yes, except for GI Bill. Uncharacterized, yes. Other than honorable, maybe. Bad conduct, maybe. Dishonorable, no. What's important to note, especially when we talk anywhere from general to bad conduct, is that there's a host of reasons you could get any one of those discharges, especially not even so much bad conduct, but other than honorable. And let's say you've had multiple tours. Let's say you're dealing with a lot of issues as a result of your time in service, and especially based on the amount of tours that you've had. Let's say it's impacting your ability to be in the military and part of that service. And then let's say you get a general or other than honorable discharge. Well, you get an other than honorable discharge, there's a chance you're not going to get your VA benefits in order to treat those issues that you developed during your time in service. And ultimately, you got discharged in the first place because of those problems that you've had with that time in service. People use it kind of as an alternate means of actually granting a person a medical discharge, and as a way to kind of expedite them just getting out of the military. And that's hugely problematic. That's thousands of veterans we're talking about that may not have the necessary VA benefits that they've earned, and is jeopardizing their livelihoods as a result. Aging veterans continue to represent the largest population of veterans. We're talking about 66% of the veteran population, and 22% of that are over 75 years old. They tend to be physically older than their chronological age. Now, what we mean by that is usually what you're dealing with in the military when we talk about your physical health, when we talk about your mental health, when we talk about your maturity. You are aged far beyond what you would normally be seen or compared to as your actual chronological age and what's representative of your chronological age. Aging veterans also face an increased risk for suicide. Something that doesn't really get talked about when we talk about veterans and we talk about veteran culture and what they're dealing with is families. Families most often live on military bases with other families and are often viewed as a closed society because at the end of the day, they're living on a base. That base isn't necessarily accessible to the public. Their friendships and their community starts being developed with other family members that are on that base. Military spouse identification is ingrained into military culture and access to health and other services through the service member. And the responsibility intensifies after a veteran returns home from deployment. Let's say they're dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of stress. They're trying to de-stress and reintegrate back into the world. And that burden falls onto the family in order to take care of them. We're talking about caregiver burden that's happening to these family members. And kind of reflecting back when we talk about suicide, suicide oftentimes isn't necessarily seen as a social epidemic that it is. We think about it and characterize it as thinking about that single person that may have committed suicide. But if that veteran commits suicide, other people that are connected to that person, whether they're family, friends, or other veterans that are close to that person, are now at an increased risk for suicide. And those numbers aren't tracked. So there are family members out there that do commit suicide when their loved ones commit suicide, and that goes completely missing because it's not under the purview of the VA to keep track of those specific records or the military. Women veterans experience many of the short and long-term needs and consequences as male veterans. They also have unique and gender-specific experiences as well, which is really important in the sense of they are a smaller demographic within the military, and a lot of statistics that we're seeing about different issues that women veterans are facing are substantially higher than their male counterparts. When we talk about women in the military, these are the numbers. So again, thinking they're 15% of the active duty force, 19% of the National Guard and Reserve component, 20% of new recruits, and 10% of our veterans, even though that number is projected to nearly double over the next 20 years. We're talking about a significant yet smaller portion of the military that are facing drastically higher rates of mental health crises, dealing with military sexual trauma, and just dealing with a host of issues that are completely disproportionate to the number of them that are in service. Talking about LGBTQ veterans and service members, the military is the largest employer of the LGBTQ community. In particular, it's the largest employer of trans individuals. VHA can provide all the medical and mental health services specific to this population, depending on their separation status. And specifically, when we talk about trans persons, it is able to basically provide all the medical and mental health services to them except for gender confirmation surgery. Now, when we think about this in the greater context of political arguments and we think about the narrative of being able to serve within the military, it's important to distinguish the VA and the military are not part of the same branch of government. They're completely separate departments. And the VA is continuing to give that medical care and push that medical care out with whatever is happening in the military at the time. We've talked about military records before, and it's important again to note that things like DD-214 is one of your most vital documents that you can have, and that essentially proves your military record. And then on top of that, it's important to keep military medical records and military service records. It's important because the physical paperwork that you have may not necessarily match what's been uploaded into the database. And you can go back and you can electronically get those records with some degrees of difficulty, but they might be incomplete to what you actually developed during your time in service. When we talk about the VA, a lot of the times we're just lumping everything under the VA. I've done that a few times under the course of this presentation, but when we talk about healthcare within the VA, we're talking about the Veteran Health Administration. When we talk about benefits such as GI Bill, disability, pension, we're talking about the Veterans Benefits Administration. And then there's National Cemetery Administration. And these are the three components of the Department of Affairs. They do cross over with a lot of other groups. So when we think of the Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Service, and then when we think of Housing and Urban Development, HUD is specifically tackling and dealing with a lot of grants when it comes to homeless veterans, and that's not directly with the VA, that's in partnership with the VA. At the California state level, when it comes to agencies, we have groups like CalVet, which operates veterans homes, state home loans, VA claims, works on advocacy and assistance as well as education. We also have EDD, where it comes with employment assistance, job placement, and resume help, and they also do have veteran-specific work when it comes to EDD. The next level is also local and non-governmental agencies. Each county within the state of California has a veteran service office. They're meant to assist the veteran community by any means that they can. They're a great immediate resource, especially if you're looking for other local resources specific to your county. Local nonprofits as well. This varies. Sometimes rural areas can struggle a little bit more to have resources. We've discussed this with places like further up into Northern California. You'll tend to see a lot more, especially congregate towards urban areas, either in San Francisco, Los Angeles, or San Diego. Local nonprofits may also administer federal and state programs, such as supported services for veterans and families, SSVF, which is rapid rehousing and eviction prevention, transitional supportive housing, and permanent supportive housing. Some also provide employment and training services through DOL grants and California VEEP contracts. When we talk about helping veterans, a lot of people as individuals come up asking about how they can help veterans, whether it's just them as a person or them as a person working in their specific organization. And a small way to summarize that or have a pretty solid idea of that, here's a few points. So when you're communicating with a veteran, you're talking with a veteran, work on rapport building. We've discussed earlier as well that veterans may not self-identify for a whole variety of reasons, so you may not know that the person is a veteran. This is kind of operating under the premise that you do, or maybe you knew about it beforehand. If they're wearing something that might be military-oriented, don't necessarily jump to them potentially being veterans. But so let's say, you're building rapport, welcome home, how can I help you? Ask factual, logical questions. If you're asking about their time in service or if you're trying to develop a personal relationship with them, how long have you been out of the military or been home? What did you do in your time in service? What was your military occupational specialty? If you're working in a capacity where you're trying to give this person attached to resources, or there might be seeming like appropriate parts of the conversation to attach them to the resources, if you have those resources on hand or know that you can connect this person with resources, do that if it seems appropriate. If they're having issues when it comes to housing or maybe employment, or maybe they're just trying to connect to the community, if you know of the resources or you know how to find those resources by plugging them in, that can also be a really great thing. There are a lot of resources for a lot of different things for veterans. Problem tends to be, what do you know about and what are you accessible to? And then another part of that is avoiding judging statements and questions. Now, I'm going to assume most of you are not going to ask, how many people did you kill? The reason we have this question up here, though, is because this is actually a frequent enough question to have to be addressed, unfortunately. It just doesn't seem like a question that would come up in any kind of proper conversation, and it's not remotely okay. Or thank you for your service. Now, that one tends to throw people for a loop. They don't necessarily understand, why would I avoid saying thank you for your service, especially when that's such an ingrained part of how we in the U.S. treat our veterans. But the reality is that a lot of veterans have a lot of different feelings about their time in service. They also have a lot of different feelings about how civilians treat us as a result of our time in service. So, if you're talking to somebody, you find out they're a veteran, one of the first things you say to them is thank you for your service, and you don't know anything about them. They could have a problem with their time in service. They could be resentful of the military. They could just treat it as like, hey, you don't know what I did and you're thanking me for something you don't know about. Like, it feels shallow, like a really, really shallow, like half-hearted compliment. To them, it's just kind of like, okay, like whatever. There's a bunch of different reasons why a person, they're just kind of like, like maybe they just don't have a response to it or does nothing for the conversation. On the other hand, let's say you're talking to a person, they seem super proud of their time in service. You've gotten to know them, you've had a meaningful conversation with them by this point, and you think you can make that call. Then if you say something like, thank you for your service, what you're doing now is you're giving more meaningful context to that phrase. And that person is going to feel more genuinely appreciated for it. For the most part, don't worry about it. It's not something that we're necessarily, like, it can feel a little bit off. It just feels weird, just feels shallow. Again, it's a whole host of different reasons. And so it's more something that we don't recommend starting off with. We recommend kind of being wary of. If it seems absolutely appropriate, and especially after you've done rapport building, then by all means you can make that call. I'm personally fine with, not being told that. I know quite a few other veterans who, despite quite a lot of different views, tend to all kind of agree that being thanked for the service is kind of weird. And that can also be a generational thing as well. Younger veterans definitely feel more like that. Older veterans tend to differ quite a bit on it. Here are some resources that we're going to be giving. You can Google these later. If for some reason you don't write them down, if you decide to use this as a reference, that's also fine. These are resources that you connect to and can help veterans. If you are looking for further information, please investigate the links below that could be relevant to your specific profession. We appreciate your interest in veterans as a whole, and we thank you for your attendance.